2, 3, 4.
All right, we're back, Country and Cold Cans, on what I guess if you're a gamer or used to be a gamer, you could almost call this a side quest, if you will. I'm Logan sitting here with Classic Rock Carter, and it's just me and CRC today because we're wanting to cover a little bit of something that kind of dives into it simultaneously has one foot in the roots music world, another foot into I guess you would call it the classic rock world, with Ringo Starr's new country album that came out January 10th. So obviously Carter's a big classic rock guy. And he had sent something saying, hey, we should do something on this. I was down. So we've been listening to the album for the past, week or so, gathering our thoughts on this, gathering our thoughts on how, like, it's interesting because Ringo's in his 80s now. And this is his second country record, actually, because his first one was in 1970. So there's how many years is that? I'm not good at math. 55 years in between country projects. So it's interesting when you have one of the Beatles, for the young folk out there who don't, or they're like, who's this Ringo who? Ringo is the drummer for the Beatles. And so that's why it is significant and it's worth talking about when he kind of dips his foot back into the country space. Because Ringo has a little bit of a history with country music. He's always been a country fan. Like in 1965, their record Help, he was the one who did the vocals when they covered Buck Owens' Act Naturally. So Ringo has always had an appreciation for country music.
Yeah, it's very, Ringo is somebody who, to a lot of people who knew the Beatles, Ringo was the joke character of the Beatles. Ringo was, to typecast him as most people do with boy band members, he was the funny, dumb one. He had his fans. There was a big movement when he first became the drummer of the Beatles, that there were a lot of people who really liked him. They even
because he wasn't the original drummer, if I remember correctly, right?
He was not. I'll get into that when we get into the. I'll do a little history recap here for all the kiddos and maybe the folks who just don't know a whole lot about Ringo. Just know him as the drummer of the Beatles. Maybe heard that one comment from one of the other members who said Ringo's not even the best drummer in the Beatles, something like that. But I think Ringo's a very interesting character in my eyes, especially. But country music is something, you don't think about that when you think of the Beatles. You don't think of these guys being into country music, especially Ringo. But he has a history with it. And if you want, Logan, I guess I can just jump right into the little history recap here. All right. So this isn't going to take very long, just a little, and this is absolutely not comprehensive. So for maybe those of you out here who are,
if we happen to have any Beatles historians, and
Beatle maniacs, music historians, anyone above the age of 60 that is listening to this and cares and isn't a millennial or Gen Zer or whatever. So in 1960, the Beatles form from the Quarrymen. The Quarrymen was just Paul McCartney, John Lennon, George Harrison, and their drummer was Pete Best. However, Ringo does not join until 1962. This was due to the fact that John, Paul, and George were not very happy with Pete Best's drum playing, and they told their manager, and their manager fired him. Ringo was playing in another band at the time known as Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, and he got the opportunity to be the drummer with them. Of course, a lot of people say Pete Best is the fifth Beatle, and a lot of people have known that Pete Best throughout history has been very salty about the fact that he was not considered a lot when it came to the Beatles.
Is he still alive or not?
I remember, and it's going to be hilarious when I tell you where I know this from. It was in pro wrestler Chris Jericho's first biography. He went and visited Pete Best's house when he was first in England, and Pete Best pretty much told him to fuck off and get off my property because I'm still, because I don't want to have anything to do with the Beatles.
He's still living currently too, as of this recording in January 2025. He's
yes,
84.
he's still alive, and apparently he got back into music and like very later in his career. He made the Pete Best Band, but anyway, that's an entirely different can of worms. So Ringo joins the Beatles in 1962. They get worldwide fame in 1964 when they perform on the Ed Sullivan Show. And then from there, they pretty much enjoy they're pretty much one of the biggest bands in history, people. Like
the
Beatles.
That's putting it lightly.
So let's talk about who Ringo is in the band. Now, Ringo is not a singer-songwriter along the lines of a Paul McCartney, a John Lennon, or a George Harrison, who many people consider to be three of the biggest singer-songwriters and three of the best singer-songwriters in history. Ringo was more happy kind of being in the background. He usually got to sing one song per album. Probably some of you know a lot of Ringo's songs. Everyone knows Yellow Submarine. Everyone knows With a Little Help from My Friends. I Get By with a Little Help from My Friends. He also helped write and sing Don't Pass Me By and Octopus's Garden as four of his big hits. He wrote some others. He performed some others. But honestly, he was very happy just doing one song per album. He often wrote that he's mentioned that he often felt really isolated from the other members of the band because you had John, Paul, and George who were like doing all these really different, innovative, pushing the boundaries of what rock music could be at the time and just going crazy in the recording studio with their session artists. And meanwhile, Ringo's playing cards at the table with the manager, and he wasn't needed because he couldn't really play those sorts of songs. He couldn't get into the mindset of those sorts of songs with his drumming. And as with any sort of boy band, those of you who are our age remember ones like NSYNC and the Backstreet Boys, more common ones being like One Direction, or even today, K-pop group BTS. All boy band members fall into typecast.
No idea who that last one is that you were talking about.
Yeah, that even now that's probably a bit out of date because they were like 5 years ago. Whatever. All boy band members get typecast into roles. Paul was the leader. John was like the thoughtful, caring one. George was the spiritual one. Ringo was the funny, dumb one. Essentially, Ringo was the one who pretty much stood around in the background, happy, smiling. He was just happy to be there. If I could put him in a more millennial comparison, Ringo Starr is to the Beatles as Michelangelo is to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. But, and I mean, if you watch any sort of media from that time, if you watch Yellow Submarine, the movie, if you watch any sort of their documentaries, if you watch the Beatles animated TV show that was on at the time.
They had a TV show.
They had a TV show. It was animated. And Ringo's always the dumb, stupid one who's just following along behind the group and making funny little jokes. And everybody just goes, "Oh, Ringo, you're so fucking stupid," you know. But anyway.
I'm pretty sure in 1960s America they dropped the F word on.
They didn't say the F word on. They didn't say the F word on national TV. No, on a children's television show. No, but so 1970, the Beatles announced their breakup. There were a lot of hard times in the recording of one of their of the Get Back album. Ringo especially mentions that during that album he had to take a 2-week vacation. He just up and left and took a vacation and came back. He was very badly missed. They actually put flowers on his drum set when he came back with a banner saying, "Welcome back, Ringo." But he was sick of Paul being so overbearing about what he wanted on the album. John was being a prick. He was getting a little upset with Yoko Ono being constantly around, which, by the way, Yoko Ono was not the main reason that the Beatles broke up. The Beatles had been having issues for a long time before Yoko came into the picture. It was mostly due to the fact that John and George were being overbearing pricks and had very differing opinions about where they wanted to go with their music. So in 1970, the Beatles break up. The Beatles literally lasted 6 years on top of the world, and that's crazy to think about. 6 years of being the biggest band in the world, and then they just stopped.
That would be like basically, for contextualization, because I actually saw a post about this on X today. The beginning of COVID, the Beatles hit the scene and are together. They break up now.
Yeah, pretty much. Or like they break up next year. Yeah.
Well, no. It would be like everybody remembered COVID March of 2020. That would be breaking up March of 2025.
Yeah. So
which is wild to think about that was only a very short run on top.
Incredibly short run on top.
Inarguably the most influential musical act.
But they were burnt out. They were constantly either touring or they were in the studio almost that entire 5 years, 5-6 years, and not including their little trip to India, where with the Maharishi, where John and George were super into it. Paul tagged along because he was the leader and he didn't want them to do anything stupid. And Ringo tagged along because his 3 best friends went and he just wanted to hang out with them still. He didn't want to be alone in the States. So they break up. All of them start doing solo work. They all have really, really prolific like solo careers. Paul McCartney goes on to form the band Wings with such hits as Band on the Run. John Lennon does a lot of solo work and also does work with Yoko. He releases Imagine, which
single worst song in the history of existence.
The hot take of this, the hot take of this podcast will be that both myself and Logan think Imagine by John Lennon is one of the worst songs in history. You can quote us on that.
Yeah,
it's terrible. The lyrics don't make much sense.
It's trite and terrible lyrically, and it's also the most bland, boring production of a song that's ever existed in the history of music. I have always absolutely detested that song and everything.
Yes. So John does that. George Harrison pretty much pulls George Harrison essentially takes all of his songs that he's been unable to put onto Beatles albums, and he just unloads them in a ton of solo albums. I think he put out a triple album when he first got out of the Beatles. He had so many songs. Doing the
streaming thing before streaming was a thing.
Yeah, essentially. And of course, put out some of the greatest songs ever, like My Sweet Lord, and I've Got My Mind Set on You throughout the years. But where does that leave Ringo? Well, as Ringo is not much of a singer-songwriter himself, Ringo ends up playing drums on Lennon and Harrison's first few solo albums, and in return they end up help writing and producing a lot of songs for Ringo's solo albums. 2 of Ringo's big hits, It Don't Come Easy and Back Off Boogaloo, are both songs that he co-wrote and had help producing from mostly George Harrison.
And like we said at the top of the show, like they broke up in 1970. I believe it was 1970 that he put out his first country record too. And within that, he did similar to what he did on this one 55 years later, to where he had like well-known people feature on the record. Of one off the top of my head, I know that was on it was Charlie Daniels. He was featured on that project. So Ringo has a long history of being an appreciator of country music. And like I said, there are some select songs here and there that they would even kind of tout as a country and Western song at the time that had Ringo's fingerprints all over it. Ringo was the guy that kind of had that influence within the band, a little bit more in earnest than, say, the other 3 members of the Beatles.
Yes. So a big thing about Ringo is that by being one of the Beatles and by being such a fun-loving, likable guy, Ringo made a lot of connections very quickly, especially in the music scene and in Hollywood. He spends most of the 70s releasing a bunch of albums to varying success. A lot of his albums feature a lot of covers alongside a lot of the songs that like John and George.
Which also contextually was very common at the time. From like the 60s, 70s, and 80s in particular, Like even if you look in the country space, it was not uncommon for someone to release multiple covers on a record and multiple people to drop the same song within the same calendar year. There wasn't as much ownership and like this is such and such a song back then as it is now. If you even look at like Waylon Jennings and Hank Jr. back in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, like they would release covers of people like Marshall Tucker Band. So it was a much more accepted and prevalent thing at that time than it is in today's music space.
Yes, absolutely. There were multiple periods in the 70s, especially, where you would have the same song covered by three different bands on the charts at the same time. It was crazy back then, the Wild West of music. So, Ringo, one of the big things about his life is that he had a ton of medical issues. He had peritonitis since he was a child. He suffered from tuberculosis as a kid. He had multiple food allergies, and he went into a car wreck in the early 80s. And this was also compounded by the fact that once he broke away, not only during the Beatles was he doing a lot of drinking and hard drugs. Once he got away from the Beatles, he continued that and probably was doing it even more unchecked throughout the 70s and the 80s. He eventually did detox in 1988, and I believe for the most part has been mostly sober since then, but he's always suffered from a ton of medical issues, and I think that really influences his perspective on life and where he comes from when he comes from with a lot of his music, and how a lot of his music is very happy, smiley, peace and love, you know, that kind of stuff. Dude's had a hard life. He was pretty much homeless at like a few years before he joined a lot of these bands. Of course, one thing I have to mention, the way that I first met Ringo was that Ringo, once he stopped doing, or while he was outside of the Beatles, did a lot of movies. He did a lot of outside projects. A lot of these movies are lost to time. But the one way I know him, which holds a special place in my heart, is that in 1984 and in 1986, he narrated Thomas the Tank Engine seasons 1 and 2, which of course was a big part of my childhood growing up. He did in the English version, or the British version of it, which then came to the States in the late 80s and early 90s. So that was my first, the first way I was introduced to Ringo. 1989, he starts up Ringo Starr and his all-star band, and he continues just kind of recording throughout the 90s. He does Beatle tribute acts. John Lennon is killed in 1980, and he does a tribute act for that. I believe he did a tribute act for George Harrison when Harrison died of lung cancer. And pretty much just throughout the 2000s, he keeps on keeping on. Single stuff, his all-star band. He does a few things with McCartney. He's just a nostalgia act. One thing he does get a little bit famous for in the 2000s is his weird fascination with Microsoft Paint, in which he enjoyed making weird abstract art with it, and he would sell them like on canvases. He would have them printed out and sell them to people. And even I think if you watch some of his latest music videos, like from his last EP, the music video for Crooked Boy features a lot of that Microsoft Paint art in the music video, which will lead me to his last EP, which was released in April of 2024, which was Crooked Boy. And in my opinion, that was a lot more 60s, 70s rock with a bit more of a modern production values to it. And of course, we come to today. We have January 10th, 2025. His newest album, labeled a Country and Roots album, Look Up, is dropped on midnight of January 10th. So,
which brings us in now to the nitty gritty of Look Up. So overall thoughts, Carter, because I'm curious. Well, you and I talked a little bit off camera about this, but like overall, I would say that there isn't anything especially country about this. There are country influences, country flourishes, but it feels more Americana to me than anything. But the problem is a lot of Americana stuff like this is usually accompanied by more songwriting that has a lot more lyrical depth and a lot more story involved. Overall, this record, there's nothing offensive or bad about it. It just doesn't. There's nothing on here that's going to be in contention for Song of the Year, or in the record as a whole is definitely not going to be like an Album of the Year contender. There are parts of it that kind of feel a little. You can hear the Beatles influence. There are other parts that feel like it's Americana influenced by old country rather than being old country. And hearing Ringo sing rather simplistic songs, and I don't say that as a negative. Simplicity in songwriting is not inherently a bad thing, like some people try to paint it. Everything doesn't have to be a super in-depth, require multiple listen thesis of a song, but this is very simple in an approach from production to songwriting. Now, it should be noted that Ringo didn't really write much of the album. He co-wrote, I think, 2 tracks. 4 of them were written by one of the producers, T-Bone Burnett, as solo writes, and then others were, collaborations with T-Bone being one of the songwriters on that. So this really is just as much of a T-Bone Burnett project as it is a Ringo Starr project. It's just Ringo doing the vocal, right? But it does, when you listen to it, it does kind of transport you back to a previous era of music, because it feels like it wouldn't be out of place in, like 40 years ago. It doesn't feel like it's necessarily a modern project. Some of that is Ringo Starr. Some of it is their production choices. But I think a lot of it is Ringo Starr doing the vocal. This isn't for me. I'm going to be honest. Overall, it just isn't for me. There are some songs I like. There's some stuff that's enjoyable on the project. Is it going to make a lot of my playlist? More than likely not. But there was nothing about this that was like bad either. It's kind of one of those weird. It's a fine project, a cool little tribute from a inarguably one of the folks who was part of the biggest musical act in the history of music and the most influential act in the history of music. So it can't be ignored. Ringo Starr and the Beatles are a big deal for those who, if you don't know who they are, like trust me, bro, source. But like they are a huge deal in music history. But overall, for me, not really my jam. I think I when you look at, he did similar to what he did in 1970, where he brought in a lot of talented people. So like Molly Tuttle, Billy Strings, and Poe Larkin and Alison Krauss were all collaborators on this project. The thing that kind of frustrated me, and I'm not saying this was a Ringo, this was probably more T-Bone Burnett decision. You have some very talented pickers within the roots music genre, and you mostly subjugate them to playing rhythm section, and they don't really get a chance to stretch their legs and show their like instrumental prowess. And that was a little bit frustrating, because it on paper it shows a lot of promise. So for me, it's a very, and I don't say this as a pejorative, but it's a very mid record. Nothing bad, nothing great. I enjoyed parts of it.
Yeah, I have to kind of echo your sentiment. This album is a nice little 5 out of 10. It sure is music.
Yeah.
It's not bad. It's not good. It's very childish sounding, very sing-songy. That a lot of repetition in these very simple lyrics. Ringo himself has never been much of a vocalist, so the fact that you have to listen to Ringo sing like this the whole album, I can't go up and down or pitch very much. Very monotone, very boring almost if you're not like a huge Ringo fan. And I'd say even if you are a huge Ringo fan, you probably appreciate him better when he was 50 years ago, 60 years ago, singing songs.
To be fair, he doesn't sound bad for an 84-year-old, but you're spot on with that. And there was one, I don't remember the name of the song off the top of my head. Maybe you remember. We talked about it last weekend where one of the duets he did with Molly Tuttle, and she just blew him out of the water. It was just like Ringo sang the first verse, she sang the second, and it just was very noticeable difference in vocal ability.
That was Can You Hear Me Call
Yeah.
on the album. Yeah, this album has a few songs that I like. I really like Time on My Hands. I feel like that's probably the most detailed song, I guess would be the word for it. The one that has the most working pieces, the most spinning gears on the inside of it. Thankful, I think is also another good one. One of the singles off the album. A lot of these are just so. They sound like you went to the bar and you had karaoke night, or you had like a talent show, and some dude just showed up with like his guitar or banjo and just like, here's a song I wrote, and just started singing, you want some? Hey baby, you want some? Like, what? Like,
Yeah,
what is going on
that
here?
song in particular, you want some? There wasn't much to that one,
No.
but like that's a thread that's common throughout this entire track list. There isn't a whole lot there to sink your teeth into lyrically. It's really simple, a lot of repetition, very elementary songwriting, and it almost there are points where it kind of works and it's solid, and then there are points where it almost feels like you're listening to Ringo Starr sing obscure nursery rhymes that you've never heard before. You know, but like there is stuff here to like though. I don't want to be like I'm completely dogging on it being all negative when it's there is stuff to like. For instance, one of the least country songs on the record, but I liked because there's a noticeable Tom Petty influence in the production is the title track, Look Up. Is one that we had talked about last weekend. That one stuck out to me, but it's also there isn't, again, much country about it. It's kind of more just like heartland rock kind of feel in the same way of think of like a Tom Petty. I did enjoy having Alison Krauss on Thankful on the album closer. That was a solid song, and Alison Krauss also, just anytime she's involved in harmony, I can listen to that any day. But yeah, I'm kind of with you on your overall viewpoints on some of this. If there's a word to describe the songwriting, it's very simple.
Yeah, it's very interesting because if you look at Ringo's influences, 1956 he was introduced to skiffle, which, if you don't know what skiffle is kind of a folksy form of music that got popular in the southeastern United States at the turn of the 1900s, probably the back end of the 1800s. But in England in the 50s, it was going through a bit of a revival. They were starting to get their hands on it. Ringo was introduced to it. He really liked it. He ended up joining a band in 1959 called the Texans, which, if you know anything about British music from like the 60s, like the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they love to name their bands after United States things, but have no idea what those United States things are, except that they've read or seen like TV shows about them. Which then later became Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, how he was then found for the Beatles. But it's so very interesting how he got from skiffle and liking that in his younger years to whatever is on this album, because this album ain't no skiffle. This album is almost very similar to like, you and I went over this too, because we mentioned that you could pretty much break the songs up on this album into two categories. It's either Beatlesy sounding songs with more modern production, but I say Beatlesy sounding songs, I mean like Ringo Starr Beatlesy sounding songs, your Yellow Submarines, your Octopus's Gardens, or they sound like just a random generic country song that Ringo Starr decided he was going to give a shot singing. And even then, those songs, they both suffer from simplicity, overly simplistic, not a whole lot to really get into. it's an album that like it almost, like as we've mentioned multiple times, it's almost kind of juvenile, almost kind of infantile in how it approaches itself. It feels like one of those albums that like you're in the car with your 3-year-old and you put it on and your 3-year-old claps their hands along with it and knows how to sing the words because there's not a whole lot of words to it.
Yeah, it's
And
like
they
you're
repeat a whole
listening.
lot.
It's a lot better than this, but just for context, but it's like listening to Baby Shark.
Yeah, exactly.
It's easy for a toddler to be able to pick up on the words because it's simple and it's a lot of repetition.
You mentioned yourself that your niece, the one Beatles song that she can sing is Yellow Submarine because
Yeah,
it's the
yeah.
most sing-songy, easy lyrics. It's so easy, and it's got like a thing that little kids would be really interested in, and that's a lot of this album. There are exceptions. Time on My Hands, Thankful. A lot of those have a crumb of substance to them, but a lot of them don't.
It's like I said, at best, there are moments that are enjoyable. At worst, it's just kind of bland, boring, and simple, but nothing really atrocious or bad.
I can't really wrap my head around Ringo's influences being skiffle and then turning to this. And I'm sure that probably comes from, being a big shot and having his producers kind of do a lot for him because that's kind of what Ringo's always been. Ringo has always been a guy who just kind of goes with the flow. He doesn't really make a lot of ideas himself. Back in the 60s and the 70s, he had John, Paul, and George to lean on, even after the Beatles broke up, and his producers as well, or whoever was helping him make these albums. Particularly led to his downfall, mostly by his album Ringo the Fourth, which is funny because it was his 6th album, but yeah, for some reason he called it Ringo the Fourth, where he tried covering disco near the back end of the 70s and went terribly for him. But
and to your point, it feels that way on this project that he heavily relied both in songwriting and production on T-Bone Burnett. And like I said, this feels just as much of a T-Bone Burnett project as it does Ringo Starr. It's almost like Ringo Starr sings T-Bone Burnett.
I mean, you would probably know more about this guy and his history than I do. I'm not really sure about him. Heck, I barely even know who Billy Strings is.
Billy Strings rocks.
Here on the Country and Cold Cans podcast.
Yeah, if you're like out there and you've never like somehow you listen to this but you don't know Billy Strings, and your first time interacting with Billy Strings' stuff is like him playing guitar on a Ringo Starr record, don't waste your time with that. Go listen to Billy Strings. He rocks.
Yeah, this is not a good way to get introduced to Billy Strings, Molly Tuttle, anyone that is alongside Ringo on this album, because Ringo, when he sings alongside of them, he overpowers them so much. Like, I don't know if that's just because of how his voice is, or if that's the producer turning him way up compared to who he's singing alongside. This is not a good way to get introduced to Billy Strings, to Molly Tuttle, to Alison Krauss, to Larkin Poe, to Lucius. I think that's everybody that was on this album with him. Yeah, this is, and as we mentioned before, the song Can You Hear Me Call has him and Molly. He sings one part, she sings the exact same lyric after him, and she just whips him just all day long vocally. Oh my gosh, it's crazy. Like that they were like, yes, this will make Ringo sound really good to have her just beat the paddywhacks out of him vocally in this song. But yeah, just I'm looking at the track list now, and
what stuck out to you as like name like 2 or 3 songs for you that you were like, okay, these were the highlights of the record?
Time on My Hands, Thankful, and if I had to go with another one, it probably would be Look Up. Look Up is one that, like, I hear it now that you've mentioned it about the Tom Petty influence, like the Heartland Rocky influence, but I don't know, something about the way Ringo does it just kind of doesn't really do much for me.
Well, yeah, and I think I told you this last week, and it was more sonically speaking. I hear that influence. Ringo, once he starts singing, obviously, I'm not saying that reminds me of Petty. Ringo is his own cat when it comes to that.
Ringo is Ringo, and you can't
That's
really say anything. There's no other way to describe him.
Yeah, Ringo's Ringo. It's just the best way to say it. But actually, so I know this doesn't always make for interesting radio, right? When people are listening, when we agree. But I actually agree with you. I think those three that you outlined were kind of the three highlights from the record. That if you want to hear the best of what Look Up has to offer, it's probably those three songs that you mentioned. Because I was trying to squeeze another out that I would be like, but most of it's just there. Like I said, there's nothing you're going to listen to that's bad, but there's nothing you're going to be like, huh, there's something here. I'm going to put this on a playlist. You're not going to be reaching for the add button on Spotify on your Apple CarPlay.
No.
If you listen,
you're not going to be adding these to your like songs or anything like that.
No.
Unless you're a really big Ringo fan, unless you're one of like Ringo's like groupies from way back in the 60s or 70s.
Or you're just like a Beatles super fan to where Ringo could do a record of fart noises and you just think that it's amazing.
Yeah, exactly. Ringo could rap and you'd be like, oh, yeah, I really want to listen to that.
Yeah, but it's about like Randy Savage, Macho Man Randy Savage, when he did his rap album in like 2000, 2001, whenever it was. And that there are people out there who probably listen to it and are such marks for Macho Man that they're like, this is awesome.
Me raising my hand over here. But and I like Ringo a lot. I think I have more of an affinity for Ringo than most people. I'd put him probably second in my favorite Beatles, number one being George, and the last being John Lennon. A few other things I just want to bring up before we wrap this up. You Want Some is the worst song on this album. It's so bad. It's so boring. I would say the same thing for I Live for Your Love and Never Let Me Go. Oh my God, those songs are so repetitive. I Live for Your Love is incredibly slow.
Yeah.
Just the fact that he like gets out a word every 5 seconds doesn't work for you, Ringo. And I'm convinced that he got the song title String Theory because he just heard somebody say the word string theory one day and he didn't care what string theory actually was. He just went, oh, that would be a very good title for a song because a string is something that connects things and I can connect peace and love. So it's a very garbled, it's an okay song, but like, yeah, it's okay. It's a 5 out of 10. Whoop-de-doo.
Your British Ringo accent right then kind of dove a little bit into like an Irish accent for a second there. It almost sounded like you were mixing WWE superstar Sheamus with Ringo Starr for a part of that sentence.
Well, that's the thing is that when you do your Beatles impressions, you can do John, Paul, and George just like this because that's how they all sound. But when you do Ringo, you have to slow your voice down a bit, especially if you want to do modern Ringo. But anyway.
Which is fair.
Anyway, Ringo Starr's Look Up. It's a 5 out of 10. If you like the Beatles, if you like Ringo Starr, if you want to listen to something just for like the novelty of it, go ahead.
It's worth the spin.
It's not gonna hurt anybody.
Yeah. Those are the exact things I was thinking too. Like if you love the Beatles, if you are like a Ringo Starr huge like fanatic, check it out. If you want a novelty, like Carter said, check it out. If you're looking for your next, like, I'm going to listen to this record because it's going to be a record that I keep spinning for the rest of the year, probably take a pass. It's not going to be that.
This is not going to be country album of the year 2025 or anything like that.
This isn't like the Red Clay Strays' latest project.
We will.
That one rules.
This one will be forgotten about. Heck, most people probably have forgotten about it by. I mean,
you sent it to the group asking if the other guys wanted to join on this one, and they didn't even respond.
They didn't even respond because they just didn't.
Tucker, Andy, and Kyle had no interest in reviewing a Ringo Starr record.
So they can go do their butt rock podcast and listen to some Stained all they want to.
A side quest with Stained.
Yeah, exactly. But
yeah, like it's interesting to check out because, like I said, the Beatles inarguably the most influential musical act of all time. Ringo Starr definitely a part of that. even if you weren't familiar with Ringo Starr, but so much, Yellow Submarine more than likely. He's got a history in country music. And, 55 years later, he puts out a second project at 84 years old. Has some talent on there. I think in some ways the talent was underutilized, but he has some talented musicians and artists featuring, which is kind of cool. So, overall, not bad, not great, just kind of there. But yeah, that's Ringo Starr's Look Up.
And it was good doing just a little bonus episode with just me and the big LD. If you guys liked it, maybe we'll do a little bit more of these.
Yeah,
maybe
there we go.
Some other albums. Maybe we'll
be sure to follow us on
things.
the social and let us know, or there's a link in the description. You can leave us a voicemail. If you check out this record, let us know your thoughts. Let us know your favorite songs. If you didn't like it, how do you, your overall thoughts of Ringo Starr going country for a second time? We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah. Go on that website, countryandcoldcantatco.com.
Yeah, coldcantatco.com. Hats and t-shirts available.
Buy a shirt.
All right, well, that's this week's episode. Ringo Starr's Look Up. I'm Logan, sitting here with Classic Rock Carter. See you next time.